So today we're going to take a look at the Analects by Confucius with the translation slash editing by Edward Slingerland. This is a book that I've kind of put off reviewing for quite some time because there is a little bit of nuance in that it can be difficult to fully. I can't fully convey the ideas of Confucianism, I don't think, with just like a couple readings of this. This is like my second time reading through this, and a kind of limited background in Eastern philosophy at large, where Confucianism has a deep, rich tradition, and it is the kind of lens by which I can examine Confucianism is a very Western oriented lens, right? And so I don't think to give like a critical review of the ideas of Confucianism, I don't think I am up to that task, but I can talk a little bit about some of the ideas, and more of what I can do is I can relate them to Western ideas that are perhaps somewhat similar in order to talk about Confucianism. Okay, so what is Confucianism at its base? Confucianism is a idea set forth by Confucius in, I think, in a very early period of China, and there has since been a lot of commentaries on it, which is a little bit distinct from, you know, the Western tradition. I think there's like one collection of all the commentaries or all the good commentaries on Confucianism, which is like 400 volumes or something. And you don't have this with like Western like commentaries on Aristotle that aren't anywhere near as robust or expanded as far as I know. I think that one of the major differences between, West and East is the West tends to be a lot more what's it called, individualistic, and the East tends to be a lot more communal, and this shows up in their philosophy quite a bit. And there's an interesting study, I won't go into it too much, that talks about how this might be attributed to like agrarianism, how it's different in East versus West, because in the East they make a lot of rice, and the rice farming requires a lot of more communal effort than wheat farming, which is what's used in the West. And the study looked at the differences in culture between northern China, which is actually wheat oriented, and the majority of China, kind of like the southern area, which is more rice farming. And so what they found was way more communal in the rice oriented areas over a period of like extending from back thousands of years. And so this also makes sense with like the honor cultures and stuff like this. And it's really interesting how cultures tend to get really ingrained into the people, even like having effects thousands of years down the line. Anyways, back to the Confucianism. I'm going to talk about some of the Confucian ideas. Generally speaking, the idea is that it is a practice of like self refinement or focusing on your own tasks, and kind of the what you are focused on is ritual, doing things in the proper way. Filial piety is also important, and then also, how should I put this? Doing things in the proper way and also having the proper attitude while doing it. And so, one of the biggest ideas, or like one of the ideas I find tremendously interesting in this, is Wu Wei, which gets translated as action without action, but a better translation is effortless action. And so, the idea is you want to engage in activities in such a way that you, like someone who is an absolute master at butchering, for example. I think this is in Mencius that he uses this example. A master butcher can separate the bones of like an ox, let's say, with his knife without ever touching any of the bones. His knife just slides right in, and there's no force required, and it just parts the connective tissue, and you don't dull the knife. It's an easy cut. And so the idea is you want to engage in effortless action. This goes into Confucianism, which also has like some directives on like how to rule, because the way Confucius argues that a ruler should rule is by example, as well as just being virtuous, and then the people fall in line of their own accord, and to not rule through force. And so this is a bit it's a pretty interesting idea, and it also like falls in line with like kind of the idea of like the mandate of heaven, and where if the ruler is seems to be supported by some sort of divine mandate, let's say, um, then what will happen is the people will follow the line. And so I think about this a little bit. I don't have like a finger on the pulse of China in a way that I can like argue this definitively, but I think that this is kind of the case in China in regards to economics, where the people will not get very upset with the Chinese government as long as the economy is growing, and the economy is kind of seen as the mandate of heaven, if you will, where China can be more repressive and the people don't care as much as long as the economy is growing. But if the economy is not growing, you've lost the mandate of heaven, let's say. Okay, but the mandate of heaven is not something that's like deeply ingrained in part of Confucian philosophy, and that's kind of my understanding is like this sort of way of thinking about rulership comes after Confucius quite a bit, but it's like still there a little bit because he does talk about the rulers of Zhou and I can't remember all the dynasties' names, but how like the passing of one dynasty to the next is sometimes legitimate and sometimes not. Anyways, let's see. We talked about Wu Wei. Another a lot of times what will happen is there's really rich concepts that are like contained in one word that doesn't perfectly translate. So another one is wen slash refinement and ji native substance. Um, the point is, I wish I had a quote ready, but the Confucius argues that you need both like a native skill as well as a practice, and that you can't go too far in both. Which to me is a little bit reminiscent of Aristotle's like, the golden mean, where like take for example courage. If you have too much courage, you're reckless, and if you have too little courage, you are a coward, and both of these are bad. And so what you need is like the proper amount of courage. And so for Confucius, this like would manifest in you need like a certain amount of ritual, right? Doing things the proper way. Whether it's like decorum, a way of speaking, and this sort of thing. But if you have too much, you might overstep and do something that is bad, like let's say offending an elder. So you have to have this knowledge of when to be refined and when not to be refined. We have education also by example and not by force as a central theme. This is also like in addition to just governance. We talked about zhang. Zhang means mean, and so that's kind of where we get to the tie-ins with Aristotle's idea. And then here we have sincerity, focus, perseverance in the pursuit of learning and virtue. And so it is an individualistic, well, individualistic might not be the right word, but it reminds me of the Stoics, where it is a self-cultivating type of philosophy, where you are not, you are concerned with cultivating your own virtue. And this kind of also ties in with trying to, if you're trying to rule by virtue and not by force, then you actually should be less concerned with what people are doing that you can respond to with force, and more concerned with your own personal virtue and this sort of thing. And so, it's you're focused on trying to develop the self and your own practices, not enact specific change in the external world. And this is very similar to the Stoics, who the Stoics like you ask yourself, is it within your control? And if the answer is no, you don't care about it at all. And this is it reminded me of the Stoics like so much, but at the same time, the Stoics were like would be unconcerned with something like ritual, and so it was quite a bit interesting. Let's see, Ren or I'm not pronouncing it very well, but Ren is the word for virtue, and already talked about rule of force versus ruling through virtue. And so in this book, the Confucian ideas are portrayed in a particular way, where we have the original text of Confucius, or like what was put together, what's considered to be the Confucian text, and then a majority of the book is actually commentaries. And so there's a huge amount of editorial effect here, because here, let's see. So you can see a little bit of the Confucian text and then a huge bit of the commentary. Um, this actually makes a pretty big difference, because or like it makes whoever's the editor or the compiler like have a pretty big like impact in terms of how you're going to receive it, because there's so many different texts you could possibly pull from. And so there's that. But the commentaries, I think, are really important because they give a lot of context, and especially as someone who is not, native to the culture, and especially not native to the culture of, I forget exactly when it was, like 500 BC China or something like this, 600 BC. You're really, like, there's going to be, like, references that are impossible to understand. Because even if you speak Chinese, this is a translation, right? Because it's a translation from a dialect that's, like, thousands of years old. I think it would still be considered. Maybe the pinyin or whatever it's called doesn't evolve in the same way like phonetic alphabet languages do. But so it's a lot of that. Let's jump into the ratings a little bit. So for utility, I gave it a 5.5. I do consider it a useful piece of philosophy in that I think that the self-cultivation bit is important, but like a lot of it is like very esoteric and not directly applicable, and a lot of it is also academically concerned. So, it's in terms of density, it doesn't have high density. It has some useful ideas, I think, but not. It is not necessarily dense with those ideas because it's a little bit more academic. It's not like a book where it would call 10 easy ways to implement Confucianism in your life. Something like this would probably be more to the point, while still maintaining the philosophy. But okay. For novelty, I gave it a 6.5. This is perhaps too high a score for like the average person, but like in terms of being like in a thinker or in being into philosophy, the novelty I think is appropriate, because I think if you've never been exposed to like Eastern ideas at all, that exposing yourself to some is a really good idea. Reading something like this might not be the best way to do it, though. Reading like some sort of compilation of Eastern ideas is probably a bit better. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book specifically. Another thing, just in general with this book, is I can't like comment on if this is a good translation or if this is a good selection of commentaries. Like, I'm very unqualified to make that sort of assessment. And so this is part of why I feel a little bit uncomfortable giving the review, like in a general sense, but I think that, there's some substance here. For entertainment, I gave it 3.5. It's a bit dry. It was definitely not a page turner. To the degree that it was entertaining, it was because it was a bit interesting, and like I would come across some stuff, especially the stuff where it's like you see parallels in Western thought, but the parallels are not necessarily perfect. Like like I talked about how the Stoics, I don't think would be very concerned with ritual, but they are very concerned with personal development and focusing on what's in your control. And it would be the same with Confucius, but he would be also focused on a bunch of rituals that the Stoics would perhaps consider frivolous, and also concerned with certain relationships like subject and like ruler and ruled, and ruler and subject, and like father and son. Like, these types of relationships are not ones that necessarily motivate the Stoics' perspectives to a large degree like it does Confucianism. Those were interesting. For style, I gave it a 5.5. I mean, it seems fairly well put together. I'm not rating the Analects themselves as much in style as I am the assembly of the commentaries, which seems pretty well done. The commentaries do speak to the main points. A lot of it gets repetitive, but I don't think that there's necessarily a way around that. Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily meant to be. There's walking this fine line between being this like hyper academic text and being a text that is supposed to be more accessible. And I think that this one's kind of like medium, and so I think they do a good job doing what they're trying to do, which I think is to try and be somewhere in the middle there. For readability, I give it 4.5. I don't think it's the most accessible, uh, but I do think you're you're trying to convey something that's like semi-academic or a semi-academic like portrayal of Confucianism, or actually fairly academic. And so, to the extent that they're successful, I think that the readability score is higher. But it's not like the easiest book to read. Also, recently I lent a book to someone that I scored quite high on readability, and they told me it was hard to read, which leaves me scratching my head a bit. If you've read any of the books that I've rated in terms of readability and you think I'm way off, please let me know, because I just might be like horribly adjusted on this parameter. But okay. For interesting, I gave it an 8. This is like where a lot of the value is. I think that I think that reading some of the stuff from Eastern philosophy is well, it's difficult to like put a finger on like how to score the interest and the novelty with this sort of thing, because I don't necessarily think it's essential to read Eastern philosophy, but I think that it's like a whole new world, and so there's like really like avoiding it entirely or like not engaging it is you miss on a high chance of novelty, but the novelty is not necessarily important. Like, I don't think Eastern philosophy is better than Western philosophy, and everyone should just read Confucius instead of like Western philosophy or something like this. But I do think that the points of ingress in terms of what is important for the thinkers are completely different. And so reading it might not be useful in a direct sense, but it might be useful for seeing how different the points of like ingress in terms of values can be from like Western thought, which just opens up your mind a bit in terms of just, and like this is a very like abstract thing, but like in terms of like what a society can value can vary widely. And so you either think the West is right, or you think that you discover that it can vary wildly, and that certain parameters don't have to be what they are. Like the notable like example of this is talking about the Stoics versus like Confucius, where they are both very focused on personal self-cultivation type things, focusing on what's in your control, but the actions that they are suggesting are wildly different because they're informed by this more communal principles in the East than they are in the West. And so it manifests in a way that is a lot different, because you're looking through a lens that's much different, and you're completely unaware of the lens being different. And so to that like extent, reading Eastern philosophy is useful for that particular thing, but I don't necessarily like elevate Confucianism as a philosophy over like Western philosophy. I rather like Western philosophy, but it's this tangential value you can glean from being able to understand that the first principles, or where people are coming from with their initial philosophy, or just like looking at what's important, could vary so wildly. And it's yeah, I mean, it's to some degree you can think of it like this, that any sort of philosophical like sort of discipline or like culture or like this thing is probably to some degree inbred. Like Western philosophy, like all of it kind of is informed by like certain like Western values, or like coming from a Western perspective, and Eastern philosophy is coming from like an Eastern perspective, right? And so like when it's like that, you don't the if all you've ever read is Western philosophy, that it comes from a Western perspective becomes invisible to you, because you just think of that's the only perspective you can have. And when you read both, it's not that one perspective is necessarily better than the other, but you understand you can come from a different perspective. And this isn't even to suggest it's just East versus West. Like, I don't have like for example, there might be a deep tradition of like African philosophy I'm unfamiliar with. You know, I mean, well, I would be unfamiliar with it. I don't. or like, so the problem is like you're looking at like long-standing civilizations with a ton of writing, and a lot of like writing. My understanding is a lot of the writing of like the African civilizations, like Zimbabwe and stuff, was destroyed, or they didn't have writing, and so it's more difficult to glean. But like, I'm suggesting that they could come from wildly different perspective than like East versus West, and earlier in the review, I talked about, rice versus grain, which I think is kind of a very tangible way to capture this like different perspectives thing. Where rice communities, in order to grow rice, you need to engage in like complex irrigation systems because you have terrace farming, where one person is on top of the terrace, or well, I think you can grow rice without terrace farming, but even still, like it requires a lot of like legwork because the agriculture it's much more precise in terms of how much water you have to feed to the paddies, and if you're doing terrace farming, you are dependent on the person in the terrace above you in terms of like you have to get your water from them, and they have to get the water from the person above them, and so on and so forth, and so it lends to being much more communal, whereas like uh, wheat, you just plow and you put it in and you like just make sure it gets water, and it's like it is dependent. There is like irrigation is a thing, but it's like it's not at the same like level of rice, as well as it's only like more recent technological stuff that requires more communal effort. So you compare these two and you're like, oh, okay, you know these it's I understand, in terms of how this affects society. But then you look at like nomadic people, and a lot of these are considered like honor societies or honor tribes or whatever, where you are not grounded and rooted in one place. And these honor cultures tend to value, or they tend to operate from a different type of perspective, because since you're not grounded in one place, you won't have centralized like beacons of authority and like justice and this sort of thing. And what ends up happening is you really have to protect your own more because there's no like centralized force to be the arbiter of justice. And so the honor societies tend to be people from honor societies or honor cultures tend to both be a lot more respectful, but then once you pass a certain threshold, they tend to be a lot more violent. And the reason for this is like you have to protect your own stuff. You can't let someone think that they can take your cows, because if you live in a nomadic society, it's very easy to steal people's wealth. It's much harder to steal someone's farm than it is to steal their horses, And so this will cause you to operate from an entirely different lens as well, in a way that is wildly dissimilar from any sort of agrarian society. Like a nomadic herding society or a gathering society or a hunter society is going to have wildly different values as well. And so, I mean, this has been quite a long tangent, but what I'm trying to say is like, it's reading stuff from other perspectives is interesting, even if the actual stuff is not interesting, because the perspective is interesting. Although I found Confucianism interesting enough. As far as recommendations go, I actually don't think I would recommend this specific book that wildly to that many people, and the reason being is I think that there are probably better ways. So all the people who would be coming to me for recommendations are almost certainly coming from a Western like perspective. And if someone was coming from an Eastern perspective, I would tell them I'm not the guy to ask about which version of the Analects you should read. That's first of all. And if you're coming from a Western perspective, I would not recommend this version of the Analects either, because I would recommend something a lot more generalized that gives you a lot more ideas from different thinkers and not just Confucius and commentaries on Confucius. And so I wouldn't say this book's bad or anything like that. I'm glad I have it in my collection. I'm glad I read it, like these sorts of things, but I generally wouldn't recommend it, just because I think a much more general approach or something a bit more accessible would be the way to go for someone who's like getting into it initially. And then if someone is quite a bit of an expert on Eastern philosophy, I would tell them not to seek recommendation from me, is what I would say. Anyways, hopefully this review has been useful and or interesting. Feel free to do the YouTube algorithm stuff, like, comment, subscribe. And if you've been going through YouTube videos for quite some time now, feel free to get up, take a walk, get a drink of water, this sort of thing, and have a good day.